So I love the Borderlands series, but Borderlands 3 and Tiny Tina's Wonderlands had some major issues that the previous games didn't have. They're good games, but they fall short of being great games like Borderlands 1 and 2 and the pre-sequel. 3 and Wonderlands have a lot of quality of life changes that I love, but the overall gameplay and writing just aren't on par with the first games. Because of this, I actually plan on skipping out on Borderlands 4, at least until it was on sale or something like that. I basically avoided all info about the game, but I heard a few things that made me interested. The first is that the game has a hard mode, and it doesn't simply increase the enemy health as many hard modes do. So one of my first videos was actually about how games were getting dumbed down, and I used Borderlands 3 as an example because outside of a few bosses on the highest mayhem modes, which took a bit of grinding to get to, the game was weirdly easy. Like, weirdly easy. And that was one of my biggest problems with Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands. I had also heard that the legendary drop rate was lower, which solved another problem with Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands. Legendaries were so prevalent that they were the only guns worth looking at. It made loot, one of the most important parts of the series, uninteresting, because the only things worth looking at were the legendaries. Finally, and I was skeptical of this, but I had heard that the writing wasn't so cringy. After 3 Wonderlands and the movie, it was hard to believe, but that's what people were telling me. Regardless of whether it was true or not, all 3 of these things combined to make me decide to get the game since, from what it sounded like, they at least tried to address the biggest issues I had with the last 2 games. But the game isn't what I expected. See, I expected Borderlands 3 with a bit of tweaks, to be honest. The game is very much Borderlands, but it's a much heavier twist on the series than I expected. When I got the game, I think the first thing I noticed was the iconic cel-shaded art style is toned down quite a bit, with several assets not having any characteristics of cel shading at all, which is a bit odd, but it's not super noticeable. And that's a small change compared to what else I found. Now, before I really jump into things, I want to say that I find many people's reviews of the game to be short-sighted. The game is getting pretty hyperbolically positive reviews outside of, the criticism of its performance, which is a major issue on PC and even a bit of an issue on console. But you have a lot of people who are just like raving about the game, acting like it's amazing. And I want to bring your expectations down to reality a bit. It's far from the best game in the series. It's not some standout masterpiece, and I doubt its longevity will be nearly what Borderlands 2's was. It's not bad either, don't get me wrong, but, well, you'll see. So the biggest change, pretty obviously if you know about it, is that it's an open world game. This will be the first time in the series that the game is open world, because normally you're free to roam like an open world game, but you have these different regions and everything kind of loads individually. But it being an open world game, somewhat to my surprise, actually works well. I will say that I miss the artwork going from region to region, but there still is a lot of diversity in the environments, which is something you might worry about, given that, everything has to fit into one map. Another thing you might sort of worry about with Borderlands being open world is how are bosses gonna respawn and stuff like that. Well, so the way it works in Borderlands 4 is that bosses can be respawned for farming with a machine, which has the drawback of costing money, to pay for the respawn, but it has the advantage of being much, much quicker than reloading the map, which is what previous Borderlands games you'd have to do is basically reload the region to farm a boss. Now, I think the cost is way too low to farm bosses right now, given the quality of loot you get. It's basically the way to get legendaries, but not only that, but you're pretty much guaranteed to get like blues and purples, and you make more money than you lose, easily. That is given you don't die, however. If you die, then you just lose out on the money you spent. So I guess that makes it a little more fair. And also the balance can be changed with time, so maybe the price will go up through updates, but otherwise it works well. There's quite a bit of typical open world game tasks like unlocking places to fast travel and finding collectibles, but it's not like Assassin's Creed level filler. It is filler, but it's not horrible. The map is as densely packed as any other Borderlands game, so that's good. And there's several new mechanics to make traversal easier, like a grappling whip thing and a glide, and you can spawn a motorcycle thing pretty much anywhere, so you're not just walking all over the place. It also allows for a lot of verticality, which is really interesting. And overall, the open world works. It also fits the somewhat non-linear story where you can tackle the various regions in different orders if you want. Another interesting change is that you get a manual healing item slot, which I really like, and the healing item is a part of the loot pool with different effects that trigger when you activate it, like buffs. Most of your healing will still come from enemies dropping health when they die and abilities that heal or have lifesteal, but it is nice to have that healing button, especially when soloing bosses. It recharges, so you don't have to rely on killing the low-level minions, and a boss boss fight for health. And speaking of things that recharge, grenades have been replaced by the rechargeable ordnance slot. This slot includes grenades, but is now also where heavy weapons like rocket launchers go. So you can't have both a rocket launcher and grenades anymore, which I am not a fan of. I do not like this change. And like I said, it recharges rather than coming from ammo pools. It's just bizarre. I think they have to limit the charges because it would just be completely overpowered if you had like a full ammo stockpile of rocket launcher ammo that recharges, right? So they limit it to just like a few shots at a time, and it makes rocket launchers more like a second active ability instead of a weapon. And I'm not at all a fan of this change. I do like the throwing knife ordinances though. They're pretty much just Jacob's grenade mod, but they're fine. But overall, I do not like the ordinances. And maybe it's a bit nitpicky, but I really hate this change. Another big change is that the manufacturers aren't what I expected either. And this is probably going to be a long rant. But so I made a video where I talk about how the manufacturers each have certain stat affinities, and then Borderlands 2 added a gimmick, and then 3 added another gimmick for some reason, and how I thought that a focus on the affinities over the gimmicks, especially the secondary gimmicks, would give a bit more life to the guns, in my opinion. You know, I personally think that the manufacturers had the most identity in Borderlands 2 out of all the games. I think one layer of gimmicks works, but otherwise the affinities should really be where they shine. Tacking on the secondary gimmick was just ridiculous in my opinion, but I could go on that rant for a long while. But I bring it up because I'm very unsure of what each manufacturer's affinity is in Borderlands 4. Sure, some classics are still there, like Jacobs with its raw damage per shot, Vladoff with its high fire rates, Tediore with its fast reload speed, Malawan with its elemental damage, you know, all of the classics. Well, not all of the classics, most of the classics. But the large magazine manufacturer, which changes every game, you know, from it was originally S&S Munitions, and then it was Bandit, and Borderlands 3 it was COV, etc. It's kind of missing. It was sort of replaced by the Ripper manufacturer in that they're like a spiritual successor. The Rippers are like the psycho faction of Borderlands 4. But the Ripper manufacturer guns, their affinity certainly isn't ammo capacity. I don't know what it is, but it's not ammo capacity. Then there's two other new manufacturers, Daedalus and Order, and I have no clue what affinities they have, if any. Daedalus items reference stockpiling ammo, but they don't have particularly large magazines. Also, Dahl, Hyperion, and Atlas weapons are missing. And my initial thoughts as to why Dahl and Hyperion are missing is because of their affinities. See, Dahl's was low recoil and Hyperion's was high accuracy. In Borderlands 4, there's a weird change where outside of shotguns, every gun is super accurate and has very little hipfire spread. And most guns don't have noticeable recoil either. Some are slightly more accurate than others, but not by much. And so Dahl and Hyperion simply wouldn't stand out enough. At least that was my thought as to why they weren't there. And this change to accuracy and recoil is another thing that I'm just really not a fan of. Recoil and accuracy are interesting, so diminishing them so significantly makes the combat and loot less interesting. I really don't understand why they did this. However, Hyperion, Atlas, and weirdly enough COV are present with the licensed parts mechanic. Another new change, where guns of one manufacturer can have another manufacturer's gimmicks. One of the licensed parts, the Hyperion grip, increases accuracy as you shoot. It's pretty useless outside of shotguns because of how accurate everything is, and it kind of defeats my theory on why Hyperion and Dahl aren't there. But I mainly brought that up because I want to mention the accuracy and recoil are basically gone in Borderlands 4, and I don't know why. Also, Dahl is just missing entirely, at least in terms of gameplay. There is some Dahl stuff you can find out in the world, like Dahl machinery, but no Dahl guns, no Dahl weapon parts. Including Dahl makes more sense than COV lore-wise, so it's confusing. Like, yeah, Dahl's Borderlands 3 gimmick sucked, but so did COV's. I'm also very unsure of the balancing. Daedalus weapons just seem kind of bad most of the time, and Order guns are a pain to use outside of their sniper rifles. And licensed parts mean that manufacturer gimmicks can be on other manufacturers' weapons now, so like, any weapon can have Jacob's ricocheting criticals. It can create some cool combos, but it also blurs the differences between the manufacturers further, which are already getting blurred by the lack of clear affinities. And often you'll get stuck with that sticky Torg ammo that, while technically increasing DPS, is honestly just a nuisance since you can't see how much damage you're doing in real time. This stupid gimmick pretty much ruined a legendary drop of mine, so I'm a little annoyed by that still. By the way, another change I really don't like is that there's no uniques. Unique weapons were a staple of previous games, being guaranteed drops with unique effects that are typically either quest rewards or boss rewards. They're not as strong stat-wise as legendaries, but they still have special effects that can create powerful synergy with certain builds. But yeah, they're just missing. So that's just extremely disappointing. Many of my favorite weapons in the series were uniques, like the Clipper or the Sandhawk, you know? But it's not just bad changes. There is some cool new changes, like how shields are now split into two groups, being the classic energy shields and the new armor shields. I imagine armor is weaker to caustic damage and energy shields are weaker to shock damage, but I haven't tested it yet. The big difference between the two is that armor recharges in chunks rather than a steady recharge. So there is a difference between them, and it's a pretty cool addition. It's a subtle difference, but I like it, and it allows for a lot of new abilities, like several legendary armor shields have abilities that trigger whenever an armor chunk is destroyed. So you know it'll trigger like 3 or 4 times as your shield gets destroyed rather than just once as your shield gets destroyed. So I think that's pretty cool. Then enemies can have additional modifiers, making them stronger and a bit more diverse than they'd otherwise be. Like they can be vampiric, which gives them lifesteal. The enemy variety unfortunately gets a bit stale, rarely deviating outside of the 2 enemy factions. Every game in the series sort of does this, you know, between the Psychos on one hand and then, you know, Atlas, Hyperion, or Malawan on the other. But you normally interact a lot more with the wildlife. And at least in the main quest in Borderlands 4, you basically don't. But at least the modifiers keep things interesting. And lastly, of the notable changes that I want to talk about is that the writing wasn't what I expected. The writing has actually been decent. So mild spoilers ahead, just like the first 5 minutes of the game, really, but still, I want to warn you. But so far, the game isn't a cringe fest like Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands. It still tries too hard to be humorous at times, but it's not nearly as constant as it was in the past 2 games. However, a lot of it has left me with questions, especially surrounding the Ripper faction. So the Ripper faction are the new Psychos, and the game explains where they come from at the beginning, which I appreciate because if you've seen the video I made on Borderlands Crazy Problem, you know that I have an issue with everyone slowly becoming crazy and there not being a proper lore explanation. It kind of just feels lazy to me that they're just all crazy all the time. But that's not really an issue here in Borderlands 4, because you know they have to have the iconic Psychos be psychotic, be crazy. They have a reason to be crazy here. And so I really appreciate that. However, they're not obsessed with vaults like, you know, the Psychos are in all the other games. So the vault sign on their mask is really confusing to me. They're also filled with mutants like the Psychos of Pandora, except again, there's no explanation for that really. There's an explanation for why they're mutated on Pandora. Why they're mutated on Kairos isn't really explained. And what makes the Rippers crazy isn't the vault or living in toxic environments, so I don't really know what's going on with them. It's probably just them carrying over aspects of the Psychos that are iconic, you know, from Borderlands 1, 2, and 3, and just kind of leaving them in whether or not they fit in with the lore. They also have a distinct form of technology that isn't nearly as cobbled together as the previous Psycho factions, and again, that's just not explained from what I've seen. Perhaps they explain it in obscure echo logs, but I haven't found that. It doesn't seem to be explained in the main story. Also, and I kind of mentioned this, but dull tech can be found, but not dull weapons. But otherwise, the overall writing simply makes more sense and is more compelling than Borderlands 3's. So yeah, the game's different from what I expected, but it did somewhat address the 3 issues I was talking about earlier. Not to the extent I'd like, but they tried, I guess. Hard mode isn't that much more difficult, but it's something. And certain bosses have actually taken me multiple tries. The legendary drop rate isn't obnoxious, but it is still much higher than the older Borderlands games. And the overall rarities don't actually seem to correlate with, well, rarity. Blue items almost seem to be the most prevalent, like more than white and green even. And that might have to do with me playing on hard mode, but it is a bit odd. And finally, the writing isn't too bad this time. It's not as interesting as the original game in my opinion, which I think had a really underrated story, but I am actually interested in seeing where it goes, unlike Borderlands 3, where I was just kind of annoyed most of the time. All of that said, it's important to note that I enjoyed Borderlands 3 despite its problems. It wasn't until the late game that most of its problems really started to reveal how impactful they were. And I'm not into the late game in Borderlands 4 yet. So ultimately, I enjoy Borderlands 4 so far, but I'm once again left feeling like the older games were simply better, and there's still room for the game to fall flat. I think in the older games, the overall balance of things was more enticing. The subtle differences in loot mattered, and you weren't overwhelmed by a constant stream of blue and purple loot. Spending much of your time comparing the differences between each stat and weapons when you did come across higher tier loot was a part of the game, whereas, since Borderlands 3, it just hasn't mattered much. You're gonna find better loot in a few minutes. And outside of the bosses, there aren't really any standout strong enemies. Sure, some enemies have more health than others, but you'll still rapidly destroy them. You compare that to like the bruisers of Borderlands 1, which they were a pretty big deal in the beginning of the game. And while Borderlands 4 is better than 3 and in pretty much every way, it's still suffering from this. But it's better than I expected, and I do recommend it, just don't expect it to be mind-blowing. But what do you think about the changes? And if you've played it, have you been enjoying it? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to see more from me, subscribe. But that's it for today, so yeah, see ya.
The machine